Hey church fam! Welcome to our By Faith series, a series focusing on what faith really is and how we can walk in faith. Hebrews 11:1 tells us that faith is the assurance of things hoped for, the conviction of things not seen. As we go through this series, we're examining biblical characters in the Bible through whom we can learn how to walk in faith practically. This series follows along with the 75-day By Faith devotional found on the DCC Tally app. Now, let's dive into the Word together with Pastor Ben Kaempfer.
All right, church. So my name is Ben. I have the honor of serving here as a lead pastor. We had the opportunity to meet. I'm excited for everybody to be here. And I just want to say this, and Grace said this, but truth be told, we don't push a lot of like invite. And the reason is because honestly, we feel like if we as a church are doing our job, when Jesus walked on the planet and people who were nothing like him, they were magnetized to him. They was captivated. I mean, the way that he worked, the way that he moved, the way that he operated, the way that he taught, it was just so different and interesting and compelling and honestly winsome that people from all over the place they just showed up. And our thought has always been, if we just look more like Jesus, then we're going to continue to reach people. If we just look more like Jesus and try to reflect him better, then that's going to happen. But we do acknowledge that there are unique seasons where our city's kind of leaning in, and Easter is one of those seasons where there's a lot of people who are on the fence and kind of, at some point I'll go, at some point I'll go, at some point I'll go. And so we just wanted to do what we can to kind of really lean in and leverage that unique time and opportunity. So we don't push that a ton, but know that when we do, we pick our spots very intentionally because we think that is an extraordinary time and season for just kind of our city in general to come and hear about Jesus. So commercial over, let's pray. Jesus, thank you so much that you give us the opportunity and the ability to come and hear and learn from you, that we get to expose and explore and learn from your word. Jesus, I pray that no matter where we are in our faith, no matter where we are in our relationship with you, for those of us who walked in and we have been faithfully following, loving, and serving you for a long time, or for those of us who walked in and honestly, we are not sure if you're there and if you even exist. We know for every single one of us, if we experience you today, we will not leave the same as we walked in the door. So we just pray that your word, your spirit, will expose the parts of our heart that you're just wanting and working and moving in, that we can see you and be changed by you, Jesus. Amen. Amen. So we're in this series By Faith, and honestly, it's been, for me at least, I've thoroughly enjoyed it, just because, again, faith for the longest time. It's just this, it's always been this, I agree, faith is just the existence of a God. Faith is just the answer to a question I don't have the answer to. But as we've explored what the scripture says about it, it's much bigger. It's much more broad. It's not just the existence of God and agreeing with the fact that God is there and I have faith in Jesus. It's, I actually have a trust in him. Like a personal trust, like a day-to-day trust, like a reliance on him, like Jesus orders my thoughts, he orders my actions, he orders my obedience, that I'm going to trust in the certainty of God in an uncertain world. Not the certainty that he exists, but the certainty that what he's called me to do, when what he's called me to do is countercultural to what kind of the culture and the cultural current kind of pushes us towards. So I'm just going to trust Jesus. And we know that that's difficult. And it was difficult for them, which is why in Hebrews, the writer of Hebrews says, we are not the people who shrink back from faith, even though there's for them a bunch of reasons to. The persecution, the level of financial persecution, religious persecution, physical persecution. I mean, it was all over the place. So he says, here's what it is. Faith is the conviction or the assurance of what's unseen. And he says, in essence, it's certainty of God and what he tells us to do when the world is all uncertain around us. And we're just going to act with clear conviction because we trust him. Because if he would send his son to die, we trust him. And then he says, and here's a bunch of people of faith. Here's a bunch of people of faith. In case you're wondering if you're the first ones to go through this, lots and lots of folks. And so we've been going through a lot of the progression, a sequence through the Old Testament. And exploring these people of faith that the writer of Hebrews says, look at these folks who have done just extraordinary things. And today we're going to talk about one of the people of faith. It's King David before he was King David, and one of the most famous stories of all of Scripture. I'm going to tell you what that story is. I actually kind of like hit it for the last one. So I'm going to tell you what the story is just from the jump, and then we're going to dive into it. So this is the story of David and Goliath. And everybody who's been a Christian for over 5 years just checked out. You're like, bro, this is the first thing I learned. I mean, the first thing I learned in VBS. And that was 45 years ago, okay? So I get it, but isn't this interesting? We can know that. We can know the story. But for us, though we know this story of David and Goliath and how these two things kind of interface, and it's this story of this insurmountable odds that through the power of God, this giant fell. The one thing that's interesting is we know the story, but yet for many of us, Goliath is still this giant that's taunting us. In other words, Goliath is still this addiction that you can't seem to get rid of. This relationship that you feel like will never be reconciled. This hurt, this trauma that you feel like will never be fully healed. It's this cyclical pattern of sin that you have promised God over and over and over again that you're not going to do it. It's this, you've told God, I am going to pray. God, I'm going to start spending this much time in prayer. God, I'm going to start spending this much time in your word. God, I want to do something massive, significant, substantial for your kingdom in my time because, God, I know I only have this much time on this planet, and so I want to redeem that time, so I want to do something for you, but you kind of look around and you're like, man, I'm working at Chick-fil-A. I feel like you've called me to a Goliath's fight. And yet I feel like I'm just perpetually in obscurity. You see, we can know that there's this idea of David versus Goliath, and we can know that God can help David defeat Goliath, yet and still, we still let Goliath taunt us every single day and feel like it's undefeatable. It's invincible. And what I want to expose to or learn about today, expose us kind of in his word, is that David and Goliath was a story of faith. But I think it's actually a very different story of faith than many of the story that we have been told. I think there's actually way more to this, way more nuance to this than just David just reared back and hit Goliath in the head and the giant came tumbling down. I don't know if anybody knows that story. It's one of the first worship songs I guess I learned. Once was a boy named David. A couple of y'all know that one? Oh, it makes me feel at home. Thanks. Fond memories of that song. Anyways, let's read together. So David, 1 Samuel chapter 17. 1 Samuel chapter 17. If you're not familiar with the context, David had not yet become king. He was on his ascent too. But David, interestingly, had grown up being a shepherd. The Bible kind of talks about shepherds in a positive way. In their day, that was not the case. David had a number of brothers. This is how you know David, just in his family. He had a number of brothers. And when Samuel came to find who's going to be the next king, he went to Jesse's house. Jesse is David's dad. Jesse got all of his sons together and said, here's all my sons. And he looks and he says, nope. None of them are king. You got any other sons? Now, you know you're not the favorite son when your dad doesn't even bring you into the room. And he was like, well, I got David, but I mean, he's a shepherd. I mean, think about the social skills that you would have if your best friend was Bob. I'm embarrassed. I know. That's ridiculous. Anyways, he's out there with sheep all day, right? And now all of a sudden, in a different way, now David has said, or Samuel has said, okay, this is going to be the guy, and he's kind of like aware of this, but David is still looked down on. He's still kind of looked after. His older brothers are actually at battle because the army of God, the nation of Israel, which was God's chosen people, and God said, I want you to be a light. I want you to go. I want you to be the people through whom the world's going to see, and they're going to know because of the way that you love, because of the way that you serve, because of the way that you act, because of the way that you glorify me, the entire world is going to know that I am God. But unfortunately, they continually did not trust God, did not believe God, did not do what God said. And so they were continually kind of at these crossroads in this impasse. And this one particular time, this Philistine army, one of their continual warring neighbors, was against them. In chapter 17, verse 1, now the Philistines gathered their forces for war and assembled at Socoh in Judah. Skip down to verse 2. Saul and the Israelites assembled and camped in the valley of Elah and drew up their battle lines to meet the Philistines. The Philistines occupied one hill, the Israelites another, with a valley between them. And a champion named Goliath, who was from Gath, came out of the Philistine camp. His height was 6 cubits in a span. We have a difficult time with, kilometers, let alone cubits in a span. This is a little bit, now this is not, he was a massive, maybe he was a little bit over 9 feet tall. So some of y'all have heard of like Wimby, who plays for the Spurs. He would just dunk on him. His head would almost hit the basket. Goliath was huge. Continues. He had a bronze helmet on his head and wore a coat of scale armor of bronze weighing 5,000 shekels, again, about 125 pounds. On his legs, he wore bronze greaves, and a bronze javelin was slung on his back. His spear shaft was like a weaver's rod, and its iron point weighed 600 shekels. That's about 15 pounds, and his shield bearer went ahead of him. So he has somebody even carrying his shield for him, because who knows how much that thing weighs, because he's got 125 pounds on his back. Dude's 9 feet tall, whatever. And he's got a spear with a 15-pound, not even like the actual shaft of the spear, just the head of the spear, the tip of the spear, 15 pounds. And this dude's massive. And every day he goes out and he taunts and he says, who are you, armies of God. Goliath stood and shouted to the ranks of Israel, why do you come out and line up for battle? Am I not a Philistine, and are you not the servants of Saul? Choose a man and have him come down to me. If he is able to fight and kill me, we will become your subjects. But if you overcome him and kill him, you will become our subjects and serve us. And then the Philistines said, this day I defy the armies of Israel. Give me a man and let us fight each other. And on hearing this, the Philistines' words, Saul, who was the king, and all the Israelites were dismayed and terrified. They don't know what to do. There's this thing, it seems insurmountable, it seems impossible, and they know that this is in opposition to the armies of God, yet at the same time they're looking at it and saying, he's just taunting, and they're terribly intimidated. Well, so David was not a warrior. In fact, so much so that David doesn't enter this story as someone who had all this military training, had been battle tested, and had been through the fire, and just come out of adversity, so resilient as a warrior. No, his brothers were warriors, and he went to go bring him some food. That's David's resume of what we think. So his dad basically says, okay, David, your brothers are fighting a war, and from time to time, David would leave his responsibility as a shepherd, and he would go and he would bring his brothers food, so they would be fueled for battle. So his dad says, okay, David, I want you to go and I want you to take some food and I want you to take it to your brothers. So as David, kind of gathers all this stuff, he hands off his responsibility of shepherd and he goes out to meet his brothers and to tell them, and that's when he all of a sudden finds out what's going on. Skip down to verse 20. So early in the morning, David left the flock in the care of a shepherd, loaded up and set out as Jesse had directed. He reached the camp as the army was going out of its battle positions, shouting the war cry. Israel and the Philistines were drawing up their lines facing each other. David left his things with the keeper of supplies, ran to the battle lines, and asked his brothers how they were. I feel like his brother's like, how are we? We are terrified. Like you see him, and by the way, David, don't ask us how we are right now. This is not the time for therapy. We're at the battle lines. This is not like let's talk about how you feel, right? They're like, how we are. You see Goliath. You see him yelling. You see what's going on. And as he was talking with them, Goliath, the Philistine, the champion of Gath, stepped out from his lines and shouted his usual defiance, and David heard it. And whenever the Israelites saw the man, they all fled from him in great fear. Now, the Israelites have been saying, do you see how this man keeps coming out, how he comes to defy Israel? The king will give great wealth to the man who kills him. You can tell, by the way, how big of a problem it is by the incentive structure that the leadership gives to actually tackle this address. So first, he's going to give whoever does this great wealth. He will also give him his daughter in marriage. They're like, whoa. You are like for real about this. Like you can have great wealth, you can have my daughter. I think this was the kicker. He said, and will exempt his family from taxes in Israel. He's like, whoa, okay. We're talking about tax-free? I'm in. Wealth, that's cool, but I still got to pay taxes. Daughter, I don't know, maybe not, but no taxes, tax-free weekend, every weekend? Okay, I'm in. It's not really why he says it, but so they repeated to him that day. Or David asked the men standing near him, what will be done for the man who kills the Philistine and removes this disgrace from Israel, who is this uncircumcised Philistine, that he should defy the armies of the living God? So they repeated to him what had been saying and told him, this is what will be done for the man who kills him. But when Eliab, David's oldest brother, heard him speaking with the men, he burned with anger at him and asked, why have you come down here? And with whom did you leave those few sheep in your wilderness? Isn't that so degrading? Some of you are like, I think that's my older brother. Yeah, think about it. From his perspective, too, younger brother comes up, right? How would you feel? All of a sudden, your younger brother, who dad didn't even bring into the house, who got left home with the sheep, he's like, hey, guys, the army of God, He's like, bro, I know you. I'm your older brother. I have punched you so many times. Like, you can't beat me. You definitely can't beat Goliath. Here's what I think is interesting. This is kind of, I think, part of where we really just start to enter into and intersect with this story. God may have called you to fight a battle that you feel ill-equipped for, that you don't feel like you're prepared for, and that you feel like is disproportionate to what you're ready. And one of the ways that the enemy will continually keep us from engaging in this battle, because here's what God needed. Here's what God needed. God just needed somebody to engage. He didn't need somebody who was this incredible warrior, and that would have been helpful, sure, maybe. But what God actually just needed is somebody to say, okay, you are not going to do this to the army of God. I'm going to choose to engage in the battle. His brother sees him. It says, I know who you are, and that's not who you are. In other words, one of the primary ways that the enemy will try to dissuade us and divert us from engaging the battle that God has given to us is by reminding us of who we were and how other people see us. And the truth is David was much more than that. But what his brother saw is he said, you're not that person. It might be for you that you feel like, man, I feel like he's called me to go in love, go in, man, just the people who I work with. And God just given me a heart and a passion to go be Jesus to them, to go love, to go serve, to go have a conversation with, to go invest in, whatever it might be, to share the gospel with, but I feel the voice of the enemy saying, but they know who you are and they know that you're not equipped for that. They know that you're not good enough. Now, what you didn't realize is the whole time they didn't need somebody who was perfect. They just needed somebody who was a Christian who was honest. Because they've been experiencing self-righteous Christianity their entire lives. And they don't need somebody who's perfect, but they need somebody who can perfectly articulate the fact that I am not perfect. And that's kind of the point. So he reminds him, this is who you were. Are you kidding me? Are you kidding me? Now, what have I done? Verse 20, said David, can't I even speak? Or 29, I'm sorry. Can't I even speak? He then turned away to someone else who brought up the same matter, and the man answered as before. What David said was overheard and reported to Saul, and Saul sent for him. So Saul, who was the king, now here's David, who's this shepherd. And David said to Saul, let no one lose heart. Now imagine, David's he's young, maybe, scholars say maybe 15 years old. So think about your 15-year-old. Like, buddy can't even drive his horse really at this point, right? I mean, he's still on learner's permit strategy. And he's standing before the king, and he says, King, let me tell you this. Let no one lose heart on account of this Philistine. Your servant will go and fight him. And the king's probably thinking, and lose. Yeah, anybody can fight him. That's not unique. Ain't nobody beating him. That's what we're actually trying to do. So Saul replied, you are not able to go out against this Philistine and fight him. You are only a young man, and he has been a warrior from his youth. In other words, he's been fighting people like you before you were a person like you. He's been doing this a long time. He has experienced, and David, is that peach fuzz on your chin? Aw, that's cute. A little mustache, you get a little cat to lick that off, put a little milk on it. He looks at him and says, are you kidding me, you? Now, if you don't know how this story, let me just kind of tell you how this story ends. Eventually what happens is David gets this. He gets the okay. He goes to battle. And as he's walking towards him, he has this sling, and he picks up 5 smooth stones from this river. He puts his, stone in the sling, and he slings it around and hits Goliath in the head. It sinks into his forehead. He drops down, and David kills him. It's an unbelievable story. And whenever we hear this story, we have a tendency again to think, okay, so it's this David and Goliath. It's this, it's this small school versus this big school of this, athletic competition. It's this small corporation versus this big corporation. It's me versus this repetitive cycle of sin that I can't seem to let go of. And it's this addiction that I can't overcome. And it just seems impossible. And so what we just say is, hey, so just believe God. Just trust God. And I think that that's true. There's a level of reality to that. That we do believe God, we do trust God to lean into and to engage in the battles. But here's what David said that I think is so overlooked in this story. And I think if there's anything that I would say creates the ability for David to win the battle in addition to trusting in the Lord, it's this, is that David was diligent in the field, which led him to battle when he faced Goliath. He was diligent as a shepherd, which led him to battle victory when he was fighting Goliath. Here's what David says. But David said to Saul, in other words, David's not saying, hey, there is a line between faith and stupidity. And David says, let me give you some data points to show the track record that God has had me on. But David said to Saul, your servant has been keeping his father's sheep. Saul would say, I know that's the problem. But when a lion or a bear came and carried off a sheep from the flock, I went after it, struck it, rescued it from the sheep's mouth. You see, what would happen was David, you got to think about this, the reason that sheep need a shepherd is not because they're just, don't always know where to eat. It's because, one, it helps to keep them together, but more than anything else, in the togetherness, he protects them as wild animals, as foxes, coyotes, at times lions, at times bears. And you know what David would oftentimes do to beat them? A lot of times, he would get a sling with a rock and spin that little joker around and peg whatever moving wild animal it was. And then David says, okay, well, let me just tell you a couple of crazy things that have happened. That when a lion or a bear came and carried off a sheep from the flock, I went after it, struck it, and rescued the sheep from its mouth. And when it turned on me, he said, this is what happened. There was one time, one of them, I was trying to, I got it from its mouth, and that joker turned on me, and I was like, oh no. Reasonably so. So I seized it by its hair. Another version, translation says, and I grabbed it by its beard and struck it and killed it. David was like, hey, I know that there's this dude Goliath, but let me just tell you about something that happened the other day. I was in the field. I was with sheep, Bob, right? And we were talking, and all of a sudden this lion, this bear came up, and man, I had killed a bunch of foxes and coyotes, and there's squirrels that I just picked off for fun, right? But then there was just one time that just wild animal came. It took him. I grabbed the sheep back. I was willing to wade in this field, risk my life for those sheep, because that's what was diligent in that situation. And unfortunately, this thing tried to turn on me. And so I grabbed it by his beard, I punched it in the face, and I killed it. So I'll take Goliath. Here's what I think is just so underrated about this story. David was diligent when he was in the field watching sheep, and that paved the way to victory when he faced Goliath. You see, David leaned in when it seemed like no one was watching. David had data points when it seemed like no one was watching. So all of a sudden, when everything mattered, David had already developed and acquired the skill set. David didn't have to become that because God was already in a season of preparation for that. Because here's the reality. David should never fight Goliath hand to hand. That would be stupid. But the way that Goliath would have to be beat if he wasn't going to fight him hand to hand would have to be unconventional. What he didn't realize was this shepherding was the training grounds for how he would not only defeat Goliath, but at some point be the shepherd king of Israel, the God's chosen people, and be the greatest king in the history of the nation of Israel. God was using that season and preparing him in that season. Here's why I say that. In my experience, if you've been a Christian for a little while and you feel like God has called you to something big, something significant, or just something big and significant insofar as seeing anyone come to Jesus is a miracle in and of itself, and you feel like God has called you to that because he's called you to go therefore make disciples, but you feel ill-equipped. I get that. But God has called you, placed you in a place, in a situation, or a position that might feel like obscurity now, but he's using that to develop you into what he's called you to. See, it's often, it's like, man, all right, I'm going to start reading my Bible and start praying regularly once God puts me in a ministry. I'm going to start leaning into my gifting once God gives me the ability to use that gifting. I'm going to start being diligent and start exploring, start taking steps of faith. I'm going to start to tell somebody about Jesus once the perfect situation, the perfect context. And Paul says, always be prepared to give a reason for the hope that you have. He doesn't say, always be prepared to give a reason for why someone else should have hope and give a reasonable answer for all of their potential objections. He said, no, here's what you need to prepare for. Why do you believe in Jesus? Not why should they, why do you? Let me ask you a question that all your non-saved friends are already wondering. Why do you believe in Jesus over every other religion? Why do you believe in Jesus? Why do you believe in his death and resurrection, the substantial nature of that over everything else, right? Paul says, hey, you don't have to fully convince everybody else. I just want you to be prepared for the reason why you're fully convinced. Here's the point. There are things that God has called us to prepare now. Because this fight with Goliath was not the end for David. This was just the beginning. This was the beginning, the trajectory to on-ramp towards the king, on-ramp to warring against entire nations, leading the entire nation. But God used his time as a shepherd, and now versus Goliath, in continual incremental deposits of diligence over an extended period of time, created a life of faithful obedience and magnificent usefulness to God. I haven't really talked about this that much, but here we are. When I was first starting in ministry, I didn't necessarily have the framework to think of this through. And I just kind of stand back and I'm just very thankful that God was at work in my life to help me to do these things. I mean, when I first started out, I felt like God had called me to ministry. I felt like he had called me to preach and to teach, but I also felt like it was something that I could glorify myself in. And so I was like, God, I don't want to pursue this on my own. I feel called to this, but I just don't know what it looks like. And I want you to bring it to me, not me to pursue it, because I'll be able to glorify myself in it. And I prayed that prayer, and you pray that prayer, and you think, okay, God, I'm going to pray this, and all of a sudden, like 2 weeks later, somebody's going to be like, oh, will you come and speak at our thing or do this? And for 2 years, I got no speaking engagements, no invitations, and granted, because nobody knew I could preach. But you know what I did? I loved hearing people preach and teach. And not just from the oh, here's what this person said, oh, here's what that, but that's cool. But for me, I'm like, man, how is it that, and now granted at the time, there was this little thing coming out called the internet. You think that I'm joking, right? This was the very first time sermons were online, and only the best of the best, only the world's, the country's greatest communicators had the ability to put their stuff online. So I'm listening to Francis Chan, OG Francis Chan. I'm looking at OG, David Platt or Andy Stanley or Louis Giglio or John, whoever I can listen to, I'm listening to, and I'm just I'm captivated. How is it that every single one of them in their intro gets me to lean in? And how is it that they're stylistically all different, but it doesn't seem like when they move through the text, they lose momentum. It seems like the talk picks up momentum. And yet at the end of it, I have clarity. How is it that they all do that? And I just consumed. I started outlining, not because I was going to need it, just because I thought it was fascinating. I started outlining all their sermons. About A year, 2 years into it, I had somebody invite me to go preach at an FCA thing for Leon High School. I was like, yes, of course. It was on my birthday. I was like, okay, God, this is where we're going. I did it. And let me tell you, I felt like I knocked it out of the park. And when you do that, you usually feel like somebody's going to invite you back. And not a darn person called for another year and a half. But man, I was just listening and studying, and just like the greatest folks. And I didn't have like, okay, God, this is how you're going to use this. I was just like, Jesus, I don't know what you have for me, but I know that's what you've called me to. I know I don't want to pursue it, but I remember thinking, God, I want to be as diligent as I possibly can in this time to just learn. And so I was just consuming and outlining. And you know what I found out? If you're at all interested in ministry or preaching or anything like that, a sermon is 3 things. Number 1, it's a research project. Number 2, you have to be a good writer. And number 3, you have to be a good communicator and performer. Those folks were fantastic at all 3. They did something in their intro that was not stylistically or contingent on who they were, but they all just taught it in a way that in the beginning, here's something that makes people lean in. And so I got an opportunity to speak at a Sunday school. They said it's middle school, Sunday school. And we don't have anybody to teach it. Got about 20 kids showing up. And everybody else, that seemed like nails on a chalkboard. But after a little over 3 years of praying and preparing and praying and preparing and praying and preparing and consuming and outlining and praying and preparing, they said, who wants to teach Sunday school? And I'm like I remember this. One of the clearest times that God's ever spoken to me. I was driving down Tharp Street right by Godby High School, headed towards, driving down Ocala, towards Tharp, right next to Godby High School. And I felt as clearly as I've ever heard and felt God say it. He just said, I want you to go. Do it. And I would stay up writing and outlining every sermon before I gave it. For the first couple, I was like, those were awful. But here's the good news. I'm teaching Sunday school, middle school Sunday school, which means none of these jokers want to be here anyway. I can be awful, and I have a captive audience who's returning next week, no matter how bad I am. And I realized I'm bad. So I started writing my sermons and giving my Sunday school sermons in a mirror before each time, multiple times, because I realized my sermons are better the second or third time. So I'm just going to do it for myself as my audience and evaluate it myself, because I'm going to critique myself, and then I'm going to do that. And that little Sunday school grew and grew. And a lot of what we have today, honestly, the principles of communication I've learned, I learned then. Now, there's also like 100 examples of me getting this wrong. But here's what I'm saying. What is it that God's called you to move? What is God that God's called you to lean into? How has he said, okay, you're in a place, you're in a space, be diligent here, be diligent now. Don't think about who you were. It would have been easy to think, okay, well, I'm not that person, I'm not that gifted, I'm not that equipped, and I haven't had the experience, and I haven't had the training. I mean, at the time, honestly, I was still learning the stories of the Old Testament. I didn't grow up in a church environment. I didn't really grow up in a church context. I didn't know all the stories. They would have said Rahab the prostitute, and I would have just said, are y'all allowed to say that? But God had me on this trajectory. I want to read the rest of this story. Your servant has killed both the lion and the bear. This uncircumcised Philistine will be like one of them, because he has defiled the armies of the living God. So the Lord who rescued me from the paw of the lion and the paw of the bear will rescue me from the hand of this Philistine. So Saul said to David, go and the Lord be with you. So Saul dressed David with his own tunic. He had put a coat of armor on him, bronze helmet on his head. David fastened on his sword over the tunic. He tried walking around because he wasn't used to it. David said, I cannot go in these. He said to Saul, because I am not used to them. So he took them off, took the staff in his hand, chose the 5 smooth stones from the stream, put them in a pouch of his shepherd's bag with his sling in his hand, and approached the Philistine. Here's the last thing. When we listen to the voice of dissent, telling us all the things that we can't do, which we all have. We all have that thing when you think, okay, if I'm going to engage in this battle of ministry, if I'm going to engage in this battle of forgiveness, but man, there's just something so deep and so difficult that I don't know that I have the capacity or the ability to forgive. But God, I'm willing to engage. And the enemy tries to remind you of who you were. David had to know how God had gifted him, how God had prepared him. Or else he would have gone into that battle wearing somebody else's armor, because that's what they were supposed to do. In other words, it's very possible that the reason is because of who we were and the lack of equipping that we have. Who we were. And so now, because of who we were, we try to over-index. We try to put on somebody else's battle. You try to be bold when God has made you kind. You try to be kind when you honestly should be kind, but you kind of equivocate from your boldness, or you feel like God has called you to a ministry to where you're forgiving and you feel called to that, but there's something inside of you that just wants to put that aside and wants to say, well, this is how somebody else dealt with this issue. This is how somebody else has forgiven. This is how somebody else has overcome addiction. At times, yes, we learn, of course. But here's the reality. For me, preaching and teaching, man, I have such tremendous respect and admiration for so many people who have done expositions of God's word, but that's not me. And the best thing I can do is say, okay, God, this is who you've made me to be, created me to be, and I wish I had the intellect of Tim Keller, but I don't. I wish I had the ability of clarity that Andy Stanley has, but I don't. Man, I wish I had the presence and the awareness of vulnerability that Francis Chan has when he speaks. And I don't. And I try in all those directions. I wish I had the creativity of Louis Giglio. I wish I had the vibrato of T.D. Jakes. Some of y'all are like, well, there's some things wrong with him. Yeah, of course, with me too. Here's the point. When you see Goliath, know that God has been training you. God has been equipping you. God is going with you. God will fight for you. He's given you the option to engage, the availability to engage, and he has asked you with wherever you are. If you're not at that battle point yet, then he has asked you and said, okay, I want you to engage in whatever I've given you right now, because our seasons of preparation, our seasons of diligence always manifest themselves in what God has for us next. But the truth is that we almost always wait. Don't engage because of who we were and how we're ill-equipped. And I just want to end by reading this as the story ends. Meanwhile, the Philistines with the shear buried in front of him kept coming closer to David. He looked David over and saw that was little more than a boy, glowing with health and handsome, and he despised him. He's like, it's a pretty boy. I don't like him. He said to David, am I a dog that you come at me with sticks? And the Philistines cursed David by his gods. Come here, he said, and I'll give your flesh to the birds and to the wild animals. So David knows this. He knows God's on the side. He knows this preparation. He knows who he is. He's self-aware enough to know this is the gifts, the skill sets, the talent that God has given me, and this is who I am. This, he said, David said to the Philistine, you come against me with sword, spear, javelin, but I come against you in the name of the Lord, Almighty, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you have defied. This day the Lord will deliver you into my hands, and I'll strike you down, cut off your head. This very day I will give the carcasses of the Philistine army to the birds and the wild animals, and the whole world will know that there is a God in Israel. All those gathered here will know that it is not by sword or spear that the Lord saves, for the battle is the Lord's, and he will give it all of you into our hands. The Philistines moved closer to attack. David ran quickly towards the battle line to meet him. He's not scared. Reaching in his bags, taking out a stone, he slung it, struck the Philistine on the forehead. The stone sank into his forehead, fell face down on the ground. And so David triumphed over the Philistine with a sling and a stone. With a sword in his hand, he struck down the Philistine and killed him. Because here's why. That was not a slingshot from Walmart. That was something that they would use that could launch a rock well over 100 miles an hour. And if you don't think that's fast, I want you to just let any type of major league pitcher who can throw a baseball over 100 miles an hour to throw a rock at your little noggin 100 miles an hour without a batting helmet on. They would be able to hit something from either 200 or 400 yards away, 2 to 4 football fields down. They would just sling it and be able to hit somebody. He's like, I've hit rocks. I've hit foxes. I've hit squirrels. I've hit lions. I've hit bears. Here's this 9-foot edifice of a human being, and I know that he's standing against God, and I know that God's gifted me with, God, I know what God's equipped me with. I know the entire world says this makes no sense, but with God on my side, this makes all the sense in the world. And it seems impossible, and no one else wants to fight, but I'm going to engage in this battle because this battle is the Lord's. And He's prepared me, He's equipped me, but I'm never going to lose sight that this is God's battle. And if we ever wonder if God is with us, if God is for us, if God battles with us and for us, God was the ultimate David when He defeated the ultimate Goliath, which is our sin. And if there was ever a question if God is with us, if there's ever a question if God is for us, when we deserved it the least, when God and Jesus saw us in our sinfulness, He didn't hold us against us. He came and died for us. He loves you. He's with you. He's trained you. He's preparing you. He's equipping you. It's your decision to engage in the battle. And you've been taunted by Goliath for maybe years at this point. Here's the invitation. That you would be a person of faith. That you would know that God, if He would give His Son for you, invites each one of us with our own unique equipping, wiring, gifting to be diligent where we are, lean in where we are, exercise faith where we are, knowing that He always uses this season as a season of preparation for what's next. Until what's next is that we're with Him in eternity. I don't know what battle God's called you to lean into and engage in, but if you've stopped the invitation, it's not who you were, it's not about what you don't have. It's the God who's in you and works through you to engage in the battle. Let's pray. Jesus, we just invite you. Invite you into our hearts and places and spaces that we've given up, battles that we've stopped fighting, areas that we've walked away. God, maybe the Goliath in our life is a cyclical pattern of sin. And they've prayed over and over. Maybe they've prayed over and over for sexual purity, and it just seems like this unconquerable Goliath. They prayed over and over that they would have the ability to forgive, but the hurt is just Goliath. There's this sickness, there's this diagnosis. And we don't know if you're going to heal, but it just even having hope feels like it's Goliath. You've called people to love and to serve and to minister. You've called them to bring your gospel, but the opposition just feels like Goliath. You've called us to spend daily time with you, but sometimes the craziness of our week and how it competes for time with you, Jesus, it just feels like Goliath. But God, I pray no matter what it is, no matter where it is, you wouldn't allow us to be defined by who we were or the things that we don't have. You would simply allow us to trust you, that you are equipping us for whatever battle you've called us to engage in. It's your battle, not ours. You've equipped us, and so we trust you that you'll fight with us and for us. So Jesus, I pray for every person in this room who has stopped fighting that they will start today. Not because they're great, but because of you, our great God.